Shalom, welcome to the introduction to the book of Daniel, the beloved prophet. This is actually going to be part A of our introduction to the book of Daniel because we're reading chronologically and Daniel spans such a long period of time, over 70 years. We're actually going to do something a little bit different and divide the book of Daniel into uh, this first part where we're in the early stages of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, where as we've been reading in the book of Jeremiah and Lamentations about Nebuchadnezzar, and then we are going to pause the book of Daniel and study the book of Ezekiel, who is also a prophet during the Babylonian captivity, and whose time and writing is within the prophetic calling on Daniel's life. And then we'll pick up with Daniel after Ezekiel because his long years of ministry as a prophet extends past the time when Ezekiel is writing. So that's the plan. Daniel's name means Elohim is my judge. Dan is judge. El is a shortened form of Elohim, meaning God. His name was changed by the Babylonians to Belteshazzar, meaning Bel protect his life. Of course, this is a pagan god's name, the name of a Babylonian god, and this was a common strategy employed upon the captive peoples to cause them to forget their God, forget their land, forget their heritage, and to conform to the culture and the gods of their captors. So, we're going to talk about the chronology of the book of Daniel. The reason why we're studying Daniel right now, even though we've been studying the book of Jeremiah, and the end of Jeremiah culminates essentially with the capture of Jerusalem, which the siege of which began in 605 BC and extended all the way to the final destruction in 586 BC. So we're backing up slightly, about 20 years to the beginning to middle part of Jeremiah's prophetic calling. So this is back to 605 BC. Verse 1 of the book of Daniel says this is the fourth year of Jehoiakim, the king. This is the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, 605 BC. This is when he had just defeated Egypt at the Battle of Carchemish. And then that gave him free reign to come down into the land of Israel, into the land of Judah. And he arrives in Jerusalem and easily takes over. And this is when he exiles the first wave of Judeans from the land into Babylon, and Daniel and his friends being among these early exiles. Then he comes back again in 598 BC, and then he comes back again in 586 and finally destroys Jerusalem then. So Daniel's in the first wave of exiles taken by Nebuchadnezzar in Nebuchadnezzar's first year, 605 BC, to Babylon. This is the setting. Babylon is the setting. So now we're shifting away from the land of Judah, where Jeremiah is writing, to the captive land of Babylon for the writing of the book of Daniel, as well as Ezekiel. And as I said earlier, Daniel's prophetic calling extends approximately 70 years because in chapter 10, verse 1, it says that Daniel is still writing and receiving prophetic revelation from the Lord in the third year of Cyrus, which would have been 536 BC, 3 years after Cyrus captured Babylon. Here we can see the running chronology that we've been creating along the way as we've been reading the prophets, the prophetic books. Daniel up there on the right, overlapping, of course, with Jeremiah, who's writing from the land, Daniel writing from Babylon, overlapping with Habakkuk, who began writing just before Babylon came and attacked Judah. During the time of Obadiah, and then, of course, Lamentations being written by Jeremiah. And you can see how Daniel's extending well beyond these contemporaries were written during his time and slightly before his time. The author is Daniel, but there's also a narrator. as we have in other books of the Bible, the author is referred to sometimes in the third person, calling Daniel he, and this is what Daniel did, and there's someone telling the story about Daniel. That's actually how the book starts off. And then we have these references later on, chapter 7, 9, and 10, where Daniel says, I, Daniel, and he's writing and he's delivering a message. It says that Daniel in the early verses of chapter 1 was one of these Yeledim, or Yeled means child or youth in Hebrew. He's one of these Yeledim that are being taken in this first wave of exiles to Babylon. So could this mean he was a teenager? Yeled is a very general term, like youth. Could have a wide range of ages applied to that term. So just as a hypothetical, if he was, say, 16 years old in 605 BC, that means he would have been born around 621 BC, right? And the fall of Babylon, we find out later, is 539 BC when Cyrus takes Babylon. That would make Daniel 82 years old at that moment when Babylon falls. And prophesying still into Cyrus's third year would put Daniel in 536 BC at 85 years old. So this is around the age that Daniel might have been with the Lion's Den incident, just to put it in chronological terms for you. It says he was of a group of royalty or of nobility. Nebuchadnezzar was taking from these more aristocratic groups the wealthy, the privileged, the educated, the good-looking, the groomed people. He was taking these first as exiles to then be trained in his courts and in his customs and in his ways to try to take the cream of the crop, so to speak, in his first wave of exiles, and Daniel was one of these. Daniel's mentioned by Ezekiel, his contemporary prophet, 3 times in Ezekiel's writings. So they're writing at the same time, both from Babylon. So they were likely aware of each other, maybe knew each other personally. But Ezekiel does mention Daniel by name 3 times in his writings. And the book of Daniel, Daniel being the author of these writings, is confirmed actually by Yeshua in Matthew 24. Yeshua says, describes the abomination of desolation as written by Daniel the prophet. So Yeshua, our Messiah's own words, confirm that Daniel is the author of these prophetic writings. And the Talmud, the Jewish rabbinic writings, confirm that Daniel was also the author of this book. The date that the book of Daniel was written is a controversy. And I'm going to describe that here because if you read the book of Daniel, read about the book of Daniel, discuss the book of Daniel, especially with the secular world, there are many that are critical that Daniel was actually written by the prophet Daniel, that Daniel was written when it was purported to have been written, and basically the veracity of the truthfulness of the book of Daniel is being challenged in this aspect based on when the book of Daniel was written. So a lot of secular modern scholars presume that the book of Daniel was written after 164 BC. Now remember that the events of the book of Daniel are happening in the 6th century BC. That Nebuchadnezzar came in 605, that he took the exiles, and then Babylon was destroyed in 539 BC by Cyrus, and Daniel's writing in the years directly after that, so around 530 or so BC. So this is the difference. He either wrote it in the 6th century, around 530 BC, or in the 2nd century BC, around 164 or 160s BC. So a difference of 400 years. And these are the reasons why some of the modern scholars, the secular scholars, believe this. Well, first of all, they don't believe in the Bible. They don't believe in the God of creation, the God of Israel. So they don't believe in such a thing as prophetic foretelling of future events. So they look at the events as chronicled in chapters 10 and 11 of Daniel and how remarkably accurate they are to the Maccabean revolt that we study at the time of Hanukkah, which happened 167 to 164 BC. And they say, well, Daniel must have written after this time because these these writings and these descriptions of the Maccabean revolt are way too accurate for this to have been written beforehand. But as I said, they just deny the power of the Lord's word and the reality of predictive prophecy. So this is one of their arguments, which falls on its face from our perspective, of course. Part of Daniel is written in Hebrew. The first chapter is written in Hebrew, and chapters 8 through 12 are written in Hebrew, and the middle chapters 2 through 7 are actually written in Aramaic. So some modern scholars say, well, it was originally written in Hebrew and then it was later written in Aramaic because that was a more common tongue. Or they say these are redactions or additions to the book of Daniel based on later writers who spoke in Aramaic, and all these other reasons why would a book written by one guy be written in multiple languages like that. They also find some Greek words, and they say, well, yeah, Greek was the lingua franca, the common tongue later on, like in the 2nd century, the 1st century BC, the time of Yeshua. That's the Greek was the main spoken language, so that's why there's these Greek words, because it was written much later. But there's a good explanation for these things. We're actually going to get a little bit more in part B into the reasons why he might have spoken Aramaic and in Hebrew in different parts of his writings. But the Greek words, the explanation that really undermines this argument is that there's only several Greek words that are mentioned. They're all musical terms, and the Greek influence had already begun to spread around the world. And so educated people, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, it's these hundreds of years BC, the Greek culture is influencing the world. And they had been conscripted just like other nations into the army of Persia and Babylon. So it's not surprising that there would be words from different cultures, even Greek language, though they're very few in the book of Daniel and are in just regard to musical terms, technical terms. Also remembering that Daniel's ministry spanned such a long period of time, and he was a Hebrew youth. Then he was taken to Babylon, where they spoke Aramaic, and he's being exposed to all these different cultures over such a long period of time. It's not surprising that there might be different influence of languages in his writings. Also, the secular scholars raise some questions regarding the identity of certain figures in the book of Daniel, namely Belshazzar, who we read about coming after Nebuchadnezzar, and then Darius, who we read about coming after Belshazzar. So Belshazzar is called the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and history and archaeology reveals that there were actually multiple kings between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, that Belshazzar was actually not his son, and actually the king at this time was a king by the name of Nabonidus, Nabonidus, actually. And so what's with this discrepancy in the Bible, if the Bible's supposed to be accurate historically, specifically? Well, Nabonidus, now I'm forgetting how to pronounce his word, was actually the king at this time, but it's now found again through archaeology and records that Belshazzar was the crown prince, was his son at the time, and his father was actually away on a self-imposed exile, actually, and Belshazzar was the regent, the acting, reigning authority. And so from the perspective of a captive like Daniel and the rest of the Judeans, this person is the one in charge, so-called king. And very, very frequently there was the king and his son were reigning at the same time. Even in the biblical accounts, there's overlap of the time that they were reigning and the time that the crown prince was actually co-regent with his father would be counted as part of his reign as king. So it's very easy to overcome that apparent discrepancy. Darius is a little bit more difficult. The person that history records as Darius the First is actually hundreds of years later, that we're going to read about as we get into the final prophets, Ezra, Nehemiah, all that time, Esther. So who is this person, Darius? And there's different possibilities for this. It's possible that when Cyrus captured Babylon, that he placed someone as his regent to reign in his place as he returned and withdrew from Babylon, and this person's title or throne name was called Darius, or that Cyrus himself, his throne name was called Darius. There are just different possibilities, and I didn't want to go into too much of the details on that, but there are reasons for and explanations for the different critiques that are made of the book of Daniel. Modern biblical divisions is another issue. As we know, the Hebrew scriptures in Jewish circles or Hebrew circles is called the Tanakh, and it's an acronym that stands for Torah, Ketuvim, or Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And we know the Torah is the first 5 books of Moses. The Nevi'im is the Hebrew word for prophets, and Ketuvim is writings. And the reason I explain that is because now in the Hebrew scriptures and the way it's reckoned in modern times, Daniel is within the book of the writings, the Ketuvim, not in the book of the prophets. So wait a second, if Daniel's a prophet, why isn't he with the Nevi'im, the prophets? Why is his book placed with the writings, the Ketuvim? Whereas in Christian Bibles or English Bibles or Bibles that have basically come out of the Reformation from the 1600s, Daniel is placed in chronological order, kind of, but closer to the prophets. Well, the reason that Daniel is in the Ketuvim, the section of writings according to Jewish reckoning, is because the Jewish reckoning of their scriptures is based on what's called the Masoretic text. The Masoretes were Jews around 1000 AD or so who placed the vowel markings on the Hebrew consonants, so it could be pronounced and canted in the synagogue. So they're the ones that place those vowel markings, and they're the ones that basically standardize the text for the Hebrew scriptures. And that's a long history and another discussion. But at that time is when Daniel was placed in the writings. And so you can imagine, if you can think of the history of what's been happening from around the time of Yeshua through those centuries until this 1000 AD or so, there's very much a polemic between the Jewish circles and the Christian circles, and fault on both sides and reasons for exclusion on both sides. And so there's division happening. And so part of the reason is to distance the Hebrew scriptures from what the Christians are calling scriptures. And we want to make ourselves as a separate group because we don't want to be associated with them. That's the polemic issue related to this grouping. And of course, Yeshua being the differentiating factor in these groups. So Daniel is also written with a lot of historical narrative. In fact, the first 4 books that we're going to read are historical narrative regarding Daniel's life and his experience in Babylon. So it's written a lot in historical narrative, and we don't have a lot of prophetic oracle like we do in other prophetic books like Isaiah or Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, all of these they're speaking in a prophetic oracle to the people of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, and they're speaking this message to Israel. So Daniel's not really written like that. It has a lot of history. There's dreams, and he's not speaking in this prophetic oracle to Israel. So all of these reasons are reasons why Daniel, through the centuries from the Jewish side, has been placed in the section of the Hebrew scriptures called the writings and not considered a prophet. Not considered within the prophetic books, even though he was certainly a prophet. But if you look at some of the early writings from history, the Septuagint, that's what LXX means, the Septuagint, which was written, tradition says, by 70 Jews in Greek, so the Greek-speaking Jewish world could have a copy of the Hebrew Scriptures. So this is written around 250 BC. The Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls, which we now have as of 70 or 80 years ago, Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, Melito and Origen, who were early Christian writers, all of them spanning from 250 BC to 300 AD, they all had Daniel within the prophetic books, within the section of prophetic writings. So, just so you can compare and see the tradition of displacing Daniel towards the writings didn't happen until the later centuries, 500 to 1000 AD, whereas earlier on, history records that Daniel was considered in with the rest of the prophetic books. So that's a little bit of history of the author of Daniel, the date of the writing, the history of the writing of the book of Daniel, and just some explanation regarding some of the controversy surrounding this book and why it's debatable, and the controversy that's arisen over the centuries about it, so we can be educated and understand these different arguments. But we're gonna pause there for section A, part A of the introduction to the book of Daniel. We're going to read the first 4 chapters, and then we're going to step into the book of Ezekiel, who's also a prophet in captivity, the setting being Babylon. And then we will pick up and continue on with more information about the style and the structure of the book of Daniel, and of course the themes and the prophetic messages contained within the book of Daniel as we study that after Ezekiel. So until then, be blessed in the reading of Jehovah's Word. Shalom.